Hello and welcome to Argumentative Indians, a platform for honest debates. I'm Yajur Arora, and I'm joined today by Parvati Sharma, acclaimed Indian author, best known for her unconventional narrative biographies, among which the latest is Akbar of Hindustan. Parvati, thank you for joining us.
Thank
Akbar
you
is
very much
usually
for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Akbar is usually presented as a beacon of tolerance. His philosophy of Sulh-I-Kul or universal peace seems far-sighted and rather astonishing if we consider the times he lived in. Times when Elizabethan England was zealously persecuting Catholics, Huguenots were getting massacred in France, and the infamous Inquisition was torturing heretics, not just in Spain and Portugal, but across their vast empires in America, Africa, and Asia. Freedom of religion had not yet been conceived as a value, much less articulated and enshrined among state objectives anywhere in the world. The ethos of pluralism and tolerance pioneered by Akbar served his empire well long after he passed away. Now, in the 21st century, as religious differences are once again beginning to tear at India's social fabric, can we look to Akbar's India as a role model for our multicultural society? Can Akbar be upheld as an icon for a cohesive India? This is what we are here to discuss in this session. And Parvati, I would like to straight away start off with Akbar's secular credentials, which seems to have become one of the big major points of contentions in the contemporary public discourse. So when we talk about Akbar's secularism, we usually discuss his Ibadat Khana, theological debates among scholars of different religions. We talk about celebration of Hindu festivals such as Dussehra and Janmashtami in his court with the same fervor as the Islamic ones. The high post held by Hindus, Jains, and other non-Muslims in his government, and his many Rajput wives and relatives, his personal friendships with Brahmins, Shias, Jains, and so on. So Akbar and his court was secular, understood, but was his empire? Does like when I want to quote from your book, Abu Fazl says the empire was not only kind to Hindus but an avid admirer of their civilization. But did this kindness extend to his policies and his officers who implemented them?
Well, thank you first of all, Yadu, for having me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you also for throwing me straight into the deep end of this conversation. Let me give a sort of little bit, if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'll give a slightly roundabout answer. Akbar in saying about the 1570s is when the Ibadat Khana debates begin, when he first starts them. And this is about the time he's in his 30s, and he has just come back from the conquest of Patna, which begins the conquest of Bengal. He's already before that undertaken a conquest of Gujarat. And he comes to Fatehpur Sikri, and there's a man called Abdul Qadir Badauni, who is the antithesis in a way to Abul Fazl, Akbar's official sort of court biographer. Badauni is the secret and very unhappy historian recording all the things that Akbar is doing wrong. So he comes back, and Badauni writes that Akbar is, he would spend whole nights outside his palace, sitting on a rock, praying to God, whole nights in this kind of meditation. And what is he praying for? And it may be because there's very little that we have of Akbar that he said directly, because everything, Babur, for example, writes his own memoirs, Jahangir writes his own, Akbar doesn't, Abu Fazl writes for him, but the Ain-e-Akbari, which is also part of the Akbarnama, includes a collection of his most sort of quotable quotes. And in one of them, Akbar is saying, he's basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he's saying, with what satisfaction can I undertake the conquest of empire, which is what he's doing at this time, because there's so many sects and so many creeds and so many faiths in this realm. And he says, how I wish that some wise and holy man would come and guide me to the true path. And basically, in that sense, he's looking for the true faith, the true God, in whose name he can rule. Right now, but to also to go back a little bit further, this the idea of course, it's it's across at this time and in previous times, and across cultures, it's broadly accepted that the king is God's representative on earth. In the Islamic world, however, and for some time, there has already begun a separation of church and state. And Richard Eaton, who I think you had on your show, explains this very nicely in India and the Persianate Age. He says, and just to put it very briefly, that divine authority under Islam invests in the caliph. When the caliphate starts to break down and you have many kingdoms coming up, now, and all of whom are not obviously the caliph, then there's a kind of investment in, and these rulers are now ruling over diversity of peoples. There is an investment in the idea of just rule takes over. So he quotes actually, and I like this quote. He quotes a Persian philosopher from the 12th century, who says that there can be no kingdom without an army, there can be no army without wealth, there can be no wealth without prosperity, and there can be no prosperity without justice. So the king, as the person whose primary job is to deliver justice, that idea exists. At the same time, another thing that happens shortly before Akbar actually takes on the throne is in Europe, where you're right, there's a great deal of sectarian infighting. A sort of a new maxim is adopted by some European nations, and I can't pronounce the Latin, but basically translates to the king's religion is the religion of the people. So you get rid of any sort of doubt, like whatever. If the king is Catholic, people are Catholic. If the king is Protestant, people are Protestant, and so you try and sort of minimize your sectarian divides that way. But in both these cases, of course, in Europe and in the other sort of, let's say, Persia, Turkey, Central Asia, you have a diversity of sects, but broadly they are within the same religion. In India, there's a whole, in Hindustan, in fact, at the time, things are much more complicated, and so Akbar is here, he is in this context, and he's coming from having grown up his first 10 years in Kabul, surrounded mostly by Central Asian Sunni Muslims, to now in his 30s, where his empire extends from, at that moment from Patna to Surat. And not just his kingdom, but his family contains a great diversity of faiths and religions and ethnicities. And he's looking for this right, the just way to rule, and that justice which true God was going to give him this just way to rule. And then the Ibadat Khana debates begin, and they continue, and they go on for many years and all that. And at the end, what is interesting about him is that he removes God from this equation. He stops looking for one true God whose path, whose will or diktat he will follow in order to bring justice to his people, but he makes justice for the people, or Sulh-I-Kul as it's called, the peace for all, the fundamental tenet of his rule. So in that sense, of course, to address the latter part of your question, that is the whole sort of focus of the idea of Akbar's empire is the welfare of the people that live in it. Now, whether or not this was delivered, of course, now we are reading. On the one hand, we are reading Abul Fazl. So, on the other hand, though, there are many other writers at this time, including Badami, including a Jesuit priest who travels to Akbar's court called Father Montserrat. Neither of whom is in fact, both of whom are much more critical. Badami is very critical of heresies, and as is Father Montserrat. But both of them present. Father Montserrat writes of how Akbar is almost sort of worshipped by his people. That people come to him in his court, offering him, having made vows in his name for the birth of a child, or for the sickness, or to cure a child, and if that prayer comes true, they come to give him a little offering. Badauni writes of how he writes of how Akbar's policies, in fact, are making the, there's this one policy called the Mansabdari, of course, and that part of that is the branding of horses in order to reduce sort of corruption in the ranks. But basically, a Mansabdar is supposed to produce X number of horses to when the king desires it in return for a salary. And what tended to happen was that fake horses would be produced, right? So if you brand the horses, then the horses cannot be, you can't have sort of fraudulent horses being produced. So this angers some of the higher nobility. But also what happens at the same time is that you have other people, Badani notes, other kinds of people, poorer people who arrive with some borrowed horse from here or there in order to get a Mansabdari rank and a salary, after which the horse disappears. And he says, Akbar knew this. Akbar knew that this was happening. But he would say that he would turn a blind eye to this because he said that if through this these people can make a living, then I don't mind. So and of course there's the larger fact that there are many rebellions against Akbar, many, and some very, very strong, and some that almost threaten to destabilize his throne, and all of them are led by the nobility, his own nobility, in fact. So from this, I think we can possibly surmise that it's not peasant rebellions against him, it's not farmers' rebellions against him, it's the nobility that's rebelling against him. So in that sense, it doesn't seem as if the people are unhappy under his.
He's become a man of the common people, and he's challenging the entrenched interests, I guess, if you were to say this in contemporary political words, the establishment, and going after the
anti-establishment. Well, he's making himself the establishment, is what he is.
Exactly. But so a lot of times people counter his secularism with the argument that probably we should look at it more as pragmatism than secularism, in the sense that he probably figured out there are too many people who are non-Muslims. It's going to take up my entire life and all my power trying to convert them, so I might as well just accept it and let them all sort of do their own thing. To what extent do you think his own spiritual transformation was part of what informed his policy, the policy changes?
Well, no, and so he confesses this in one of these sayings or quotable quotes of his that are there in the Aine Akbari. He says that when I was younger, I did force people to convert to Islam, and now I regret it. And there is the idea of his. I think secularism is a sort of a modern word, but his let's say his tolerance of all faiths, so his acceptance of all faiths, is not pragmatic in the sense that it makes a lot of powerful people unhappy. So it's not that it makes his life easier. And there's this Jesuit priest, Father Montserrat. There's this one particular line by him that I like very much, because I think it encapsulates not only the challenge that Akbar was facing, but also, the challenge that we continue to face in multicultural societies across the world, this tension. And Montserrat says, because he along with two others is invited to the court, to the Ibadat Khana, to these debates, and he finds that Akbar is very willing to listen to what they have to say. He's very willing to have very no holds barred arguments about any aspect of any faith, including his own faith. And at one point, Montserrat himself thinks, well, the priests, are very critical of Islam and its tenets, and vice versa. And at one point, Montserrat feels that maybe he's gone too far, and he apologizes. He says, I hope I haven't offended you. And Akbar says, by God, I'm not the kind of man who will be offended by such things. But anyway, so Montserrat says, and he eventually, Akbar allows the Jesuits to propagate and proselytize across the realm. And Montserrat says this thing that I think is very, very perceptor, he says that he says Akbar, the king, the emperor, did not realize that in allowing all faiths to be practiced, in allowing everyone to practice any faith, he is basically undermining all faiths. In fact, he's saying that none of them is true. By allowing everyone to practice any faith, he's saying none of them is true. Because in the way that religious belief works, it's one or the other, right? So if you say everything is fine, then basically what you're saying is that none of them are really the one true path, and that is the resistance. He faces it from this part. The rebellions against him are not only inspired by his experiments with religion, but certainly they play a role in it. In the end, at one point when his son Salim is lobbying for power, for supporters, who later he becomes Jahangir, Salim also lobbies the support of, in fact, he set up his rebel court in Allahabad, and he issues proclamations criticizing his father's policies on religion. So, until the end of his life, he is facing strong opposition. So it's not in that sense pragmatic in any way. It leads to a lot of debate and a lot of conflict for him.
No, I really like that anecdote that you shared with Father Montserrat. That kind of reveals a spirit of tolerance, which I think is still fairly uncommon among people. That go ahead and insult and say whatever thing you want to say about the religion. I am not going to get offended by such stuff. We don't see that level of tolerance commonly even today. So that's remarkable. But the question is, could one man bring about that transformation among the dozens or scores of officers he has appointed in this vast empire extending from Kabul to Patna? Like, I'm trying to understand at the ground level, could he have actually ensured, like you talked about his own son not really agreeing with these policies of universal peace and tolerance, then how do we expect like a lot of the other officers to have been transformed by Akbar's philosophy? For example, like his own friend Aziz, who's appointed in Gujarat, seems to be fairly religiously close-minded. Then there is example of Hussain Khan in Punjab, who I think there's some anecdote there mentioned by Abu Fazl where he says that you don't stand up you only stand up when a Muslim enters the room. You don't stand up for Hindus. So there seems to be these kind of decorum rules being followed in different provinces. What I'm trying to say is, like, to what extent can one man through his own transformation bring about, create an actual empire with institutions that are also equally like tolerant and fair and just?
Just to refer to what you said about Salim Jahangir, a lot of this is also political posturing. So I wouldn't for a minute say that Salim Jahangir doesn't subscribe to his father's policies, because he does. In fact, he's brought up in them and he lives them, and his rule does embody them. But he's appealing to this disenchanted conservative factions that might support him against his own son Khusro. But anyway, that's even with Aziz, in fact, who has a very long and embattled relationship with Akbar for 20 years. They go back and forth. He says many things, and not only about his religious policies, about his Mansabdari policy, the branding policy. The so-called sort of Deen-e-Ilahi. At one point, Akbar puts him under house arrest. When this Bengal rebellion breaks out, Akbar takes him out. He fights on Akbar's behalf. Then he returns, and he's still very upset. Then he exiles himself. Aziz, goes off and exiles. He says, "There's no point of my living in this land that you've created," and and that basically he's being too indulgent and too favorable to people like, for example, Abul Fazl, who going against sort of the conservative elements, or even to the Rajputs, who are growing much more in power across the realm. But again, but eventually, this is what happened. Because Akbar doesn't, it lets all these things happen. 20 years pass, and finally, Aziz has such a terrible time on his pilgrimage that he comes back and he becomes Akbar's disciple, and they remain friends until the end of Akbar's life. And he, and later on, this was conclude the idea of the politics and power. It is the same Aziz who during Jahangir's time complains that Jahangir is now favoring the Persians too much, and not favoring the Rajputs. He's now in alliance with the Rajputs. So these things can change, and things do change. And certainly there are people who are who are not tolerant. I mean, this is not a time in which people are there. There are many sectarian differences, not just between. So this Hussein Khan Tukdiya, he's called, because this whole idea of him having got up when he thought it was thought he was getting up for a Hindu, but it was a Muslim, and he got very hassled. And the other way around. But this man doesn't actually rise very high in Akbar's court. There are others who do, because the systems then, when they are laid down, and obviously there will be some governors who will be better than others. Some will be more corrupt, some will be more tolerant, some will be less tolerant. Let me give you.
I think I get what you're saying. So, like in his court, over time, people figured out that the inclusion and tolerance policies are more likely to be conducive to advancement. So that is change trickles down to the lower levels over time.
Partly that, partly the whole demographics of his nobility changes. So initially, and there's a historian, Professor Iqtidar Alam Khan, who's written a very classic essay on this subject, on how initially it's mostly comprised of Central Asians, and over the course of Akbar's reign, the proportion of Central Asians goes down, the proportions of Persians and Rajputs and other Indian Muslims being either Afghans or converts or people who've been there from before, goes up. So there's a greater balance in the nobility. There's less sense of ethnic or religious affiliation, and a greater sense of allegiance to the throne, which is also something that Akbar works towards through his policies of centralization through this mansabdari. Even what is so-called Deen-e-Ilahi as a way of creating bonds between the nobility and the state. But let me. There's this one story that might help to understand this. It's another group of Jesuits who are in Lahore. This is in 1602. And I couldn't tell the story in the book. It's in one of the footnotes somewhere. I liked it very much. They're trying to convert. They're trying to find converts, and they find a young Brahmin boy who converts to Christianity. The boy's family is very, very upset. And they come, the boy is now living with the fathers in the church, and they come, and his mother comes, and there's a huge scene that happens. And they accuse the priest of doing black magic and all that. They go to the Sadr, and the Sadr is a Muslim, right? So they go to the Sadr, and they say that this man has been converted, and they've done magic on him, and we want him back. And the Sadr says that, well, the law is that you are he's allowed to convert, but so I can't really meddle. But then he refers them to what the Jesuits called a Hindu Qazi. So that would be a Hindu priest. So there's this other system that's in place. So then they all go, the Brahmin, his family, and the priests, to this Hindu Qazi, who is waiting ready. He's got some Ganga Jal, and he said, I can reconvert you to Brahmanism just now. All you have to do is agree. And this boy is adamant. He said, I'll never go back. And, and that's again, and the whole of Lahore, it seems, is out watching this scene. And he says, never. And his mother is crying, and his family is very upset. And eventually he says that, they say you will be disinherited, you will get nothing of your land, your property, nothing. He says, fine, I don't care. And he goes back. So, I think perhaps indirectly, perhaps, and this is in 1602, which was the end of Akbar's reign. And it's a big thing, it's a big case that is being fought in Lahore. But you can see how it's handled fairly well by No, but in the sense, the administration is able to handle it. The family is put on a part, but the administration handles it fairly smoothly. It's not, And
it almost sounds anachronous for that society to believe and affirm so strongly a person's right to choose his religion, move away from one religion to another. That to me already sounds anachronous in 1602.
Well, I think we have a lot of. I think that's one of the pleasures of reading about the past. You discover that it's very different from what you imagine it to be.
Right. So do you come across, so there was transformation going on through Akbar's life, both in his own mind and also with his policies throughout his empire. But there were incidents of bigotry and violence playing out in different provinces. Do you find any evidence of Akbar castigating his officers after any such incident, or publicly condemning? For example, I think a much talked about one is the desecration of temple outside Nagarkot, which we can be certain that it was at least ostensibly done in a bigoted way, or at least that was the ostensible purpose of doing that violence, was to desecrate the temple, kill the cows and all of that, to offend the sentiments of Hindus. So was there any condemnation that followed from the central authorities?
What is interesting about that Nagarkot temple is that it's all being done for Birbal. Who it's something that Akbar wants. He sends this Hussain Quli Khan, who's a Shia, to conquer Kangra for Birbal, and this this desecration or throwing of blood on the temple happens for Birbal's sake, which is I think reveals some of the contradictions that are playing out in the court. So if you have a temple being attacked, but you have it being attacked for the sake of a Brahmin courtier of Akbar's, and as Badauni in fact relates this story in great detail. And he says that the people of Nagarkot cursed Birbal for what happened. There's a record that Akbar wanted to send at some point later on. He wanted to send, I think, a golden umbrella to that temple as a way of, and he wanted. In fact, he was thinking of going himself, but he didn't go. But he did send this sort of offering. A chhatri, yes. So in that sense, yes, and he would not have encouraged this kind of.
But was the temple associated with the state that they wanted to invade? Why go after the temple instead of a fort? Was it
The temple was on the outskirts, so it seems like it was a kind of psychological exercise, to create a sort of terror, or to create, demoralize the guardians of the fort. That may have been a reason for why it was done. Why exactly it was done is not recorded. Like what the.
So speaking of such violent incidents, I want to talk about something which I personally found very revealing and surprising, actually, because we are all sort of familiar with Akbar's later period, his state policies and Rajput wives and all of that, but very few of us know about his early campaigns and how violent they were. So a lot of that came across as very shocking to me, and I want to understand from you what was prompting that extreme level of violence. So the two campaigns that I want to sort of highlight are Chittorgarh, which is where the Johar is well known, or 300 women self-immolating. But what is less well known is that after the success of the campaign, Akbar ordering the massacre of 30,000 peasants in neighboring villages, I think that was unusual even for those times. Like once you won the war, there was really no need to go after and kill all the soldiers and the peasants. And we see that in Akbar's other campaigns also with Hemu, he's basically wanting to kill a lot of the soldiers, or in Malwa where Akbar is not directly involved, but his general kills all the soldiers after conquering. To me, I wanted to understand what was the motivation behind this kind of bloodthirst? Was it a way sort of like back to Genghis Khan's days where you just terrorize with one of your early campaigns so the others immediately give in to subjugation? Or was this to some extent driven by zealotry, which probably later there was a change of heart at this time it prevailed? Like, what was the reason behind this violence which has led itself into legends even till today?
So, Yajur, I would say, first of all, war is bloody, right? I mean, we can see, we don't even have to look back to the 16th century. We can even put on the news now. We're seeing what's happening with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And, it's not that, that very much seems to have changed. War is a bloody and violent affair. But these three incidents that you pointed out, each of them are fairly different. The second battle of Panipat, in which Akbar doesn't participate. He's about 13 years old. He's in the reserves with Behram Khan, and it's led by some generals, but one of the main ones is Ali Quli Shehwani, who's an Uzbek warlord who later on rebelled against Akbar also many years later. But the Battle of Panipat is very bloody, and it's in fact it's going against the Mughals. The Mughals are the ones who are being butchered most by Hemu's troops, and not just the Mughals, the soldiers, but even the horses, because it's very recently that they have returned from Kabul to Hindustan on Humayun's sort of reconquest. And as I think one of the contemporary historians says, that even the horses are not used. Men are scared of the elephants, and the horses are also scared of the elephants. They've not seen anything like this. So the butchery is really happening off the Mughal troops, and then he's then Hemu is by accident killed, and this is one of the many strokes of good fortune that fall to Akbar through the course of his life. And thereafter, and then there's this, the Hemu's execution, on which history is divided. Some people say that it was Behram Khan. He wanted Akbar to kill him, and Akbar refused. Others say that Akbar didn't refuse, but that, if at all he did, that was his only sort of role in that battle. Later on, Hemu's father was killed by Pir Muhammad, who's one of the most violent men in Akbar's retinue. He doesn't stay for very long, and he is one of the leaders in Malwa. He and Adam Khan go to the conquest of Malwa. They defeat Baz Bahadur's troops, and there is a massacre of, in this case, soldiers. But it's bad, and even I mean, prisoners of war, killing prisoners of war is not something that is understood as the norm at this time, because Badauni happens to be there, and he is shocked, as is the person that he's with there. I mean, he's watching and he's shocked by what is going on, because he's saying that at least spare them, and this Spear Muhammad is just a bloodthirsty man, and later on he dies. He dies crossing the Narmada in a very sort of slapstick kind of manner, actually, because his horse is bitten by a camel, and then they both drown. And Badauni is quite happy about this. He says, the prayers of widows and orphans were answered by his death.
Even at that time, that this was wrong. So even at that time, there was a clear realization that this was wrong. What was done, it was immoral.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Malwa massacre. I mean, Badami is very, very. I mean, he says he's just horrified by what's going on. He tries to stop it. Also, he tries to get someone to stop it, but it doesn't. He doesn't. So. And then coming to Chittorgarh, and here's actually where Akbar, because even in the Malwa thing, Akbar is nowhere there. He's still very young. He's still in Agra. He's still actually, and Bairam Khan is no longer his regent, but Maham Anka is now kind of his de facto regent. In Chittorgarh, what happens is very much. It is a massacre, and it's not of farmers, from peasants from around. It's from the civilians who are living inside the fort. It's massive. It's a huge fort, and it has a large, a large civilian population. And it's a very long and very strenuous campaign. And at the end of it, Akbar manages the famous story of Akbar shoots Jaimal, who is the commander of Chittorgarh. It's interesting. Jaimal actually earlier was an ally of one of the Mughals, Akbar's brother-in-law, Sharafuddin. And then later on, he was given, he allied with Rana Uday Singh, and he's now commanding the defense of Chittorgarh. And Jaimal dies, and at which point the Jauhar is ordered. Jauhar is ordered by the Rajputs who remain, the Rajput soldiers who remain in Chittorgarh, because they are, this is one of the strange things, and I think it really shows the futility of war in general, because the minute the general in any battle dies, everybody else loses interest. Like, they know the battle is over. Even when Hemu dies, the troops just disperse. So the Rajputs prepare themselves for a fight unto death. It's finished, and the women are sent to die in these fires of Jauhar. And the Mughals march in the next day, and then they fight the Rajputs. The Rajputs, the soldiers are killed, and then Akbar orders this massacre of the civilian population. And certainly, it is not something that it seems that in the future, later on in his own lifetime, that Akbar is particularly proud of, because because Abul Fazl, he narrates this, he records it, but he also offers he tries to justify it, and he says that when Alauddin Khilji conquered Chittorgarh centuries earlier, the civilian population was not harmed, and he says the civilian population were not harmed because they had not participated in the defense of the fort. But in this case, they did participate in the defense, and therefore Akbar thought it was. Therefore they were killed. Now, you can accept this excuse or not. It's not necessarily a very satisfactory explanation, but the very fact that it's offered at all does suggest that there is later on in life, Akbar realized that he needs to explain this. At the time, why he does it at all at the time is also very, is also very interesting, because there's so many layers to Akbar as a person. And at the time, he's not, he's not justifying it. In fact, he's proclaiming it. And he's, in fact, issues a proclamation of victory over Chittorgarh, proclaiming his his conquest and over the infidels, and that he's not hiding this in any way. And part of the reason may be because that it's not, Chittorgarh happens about 3 years or so after he has married his first Rajput wife, Farkhabai. And soon after that, Akbar had also got rid of the jizya taxed, right? So his alliances with Rajputs are growing. He's also making this kind of changes in policy. Also, just before Chittorgarh is when the Uzbeks, led by the Ali-Quli Shehbani, who was leading the second attack against Hemu in the second battle of Panipat, had a prolonged rebellion against Akbar, and have in fact even declared that Akbar's half brother, who's sitting in Kabul, Mirza Hakim, is their rightful ruler. He's just managed to suppress this sort of insurgency with great difficulty. Then immediately afterwards, another group of Timurid Mirzas run away to Gujarat and start fomenting trouble over there. So it's been speculated by later modern historians that it's possible that Akbar at this point is trying to, assert his sort of Islamic credentials. He's trying to roll back whatever impression his alliances with the Rajputs may have given out of the world, and say, no, I am a truly.
So he's trying to appease his conservative elements of his court. And this part makes sense why he would issue a proclamation of victory of Islam over infidels, or why he would say that I'm busy in jihad. That makes sense. But to me, just regardless of the religion of the subjects, just from a human standpoint, that when you come across hundreds of people who have self-immolated, that doesn't move you enough to stop, and you still go ahead and order a massacre of thousands more. To me, that shocks me, just like from a human standpoint. And also at several points, a sort of a morbid fascination with the heads of people comes across. That why does he order like a tower made of heads, unless that's an apocryphal story? Or that why does he always insist that get me the heads of all these enemies and heads? What's this fascination with like heads of people? That to me seems a bit morbid and to some extent sadistic, I guess.
Well, no. So when you talk about self-domination, that is not something that is that would have been shocking to Akbar and to his because it was not, because the Jauhar is very much is a sort of a Rajput tradition, right? It's not something that the Mughals practice, and in fact, this actually leads to a lot of, in Akbar's own growth as a person and the way that he evolves, the Rajputs, what Harvansh Mukhia has called the Rajput investment of honor in their women, is very different from how Akbar or the Central Asians think of their women. The women are not repositories of male honor. So in their case, if a battle is lost, there is no need for the women to all commit suicide. That is a custom that they come across over here, and so that certainly would have been shocking for Akbar. As for the massacre of civilians, like I said before, it was certainly something it seems like it was a sort of shock and awe tactic that he also seems to have regretted later on in his life. The Tower of Heads he does once, as far as I in the Akbar Tama, as far as I can remember, there is one incident when he has this made. And this is again, this is those Mirzas who have gone after Gujarat in the rebellion. And Akbar, this is when Akbar gallops from Fatehpur Sikri to Ahmedabad, which is about 900 kilometers in about 9 days. And he just goes, so he's got a very small group of men with him, but he's furious. He's just furious at the temerity of these men in attacking him, challenging him, because they've gone and besieged Aziz, his friend who's he's left behind to govern Ahmedabad. They've besieged him and he goes to relieve them. And it's a very, very hard fought battle. The Mughal troops, who by this time include, in fact, his many of his Rajput allies. The Mughal troops are vastly sort of outnumbered. They fight one battle, which they somehow manage to win, and everyone is just going back somehow to sort of relax. And suddenly there's this gallop of horses in the distance, and there's dust rising. And they're wondering who it is, and they see that it's a whole other army that had not joined the first army, that had sort of got delayed, has now come. There's another 5,000 men charging at them. It seems the drummer is so scared he can't play his drum, and he has to be threatened. He will prod you with a spear if you don't play. So he plays, and then again they fight this battle. So basically they fight 2 battles in a day, and it's. And yes, and after that he does manage to win that also, and then he does ask for this Tower of Heads to be made. I think
it's fair. Would you say that, like, in such a long life of endless battles, these are just isolated, maybe 2 or 3 incidents where we find him to be somewhat exceptionally brutal? I find it exceptionally brutal because normally, if you have won after the surrender of the enemy, you expect the conqueror to show magnanimity. And in these 2 incidents or 3 incidents, he doesn't show that. Like, he shows a vengeance in terms of his treatment of the...
No, in the second case, in the first case, yes, he does. And he absolutely does. And he does, and he does feel then the need to offer some sort of justification for it. In the second case, it's not that the prisoners are being killed. These are men who have fallen in the battle, and again I would say that
fallen, like, are they fallen men, or they're the men who've lost but now are willing to surrender?
No, it's not that he kills off his prisoners.
Okay.
These are These are men that have fallen in the battle. There's no. It's not that he's caught them. The leaders, the leaders of the battle have. At least, one of them is certainly caught. And in other cases also, sometimes the leaders are caught and they're brought before him. And then sorry?
When he's collecting the heads, these are the heads of the fallen men.
These are the heads of the fallen men, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of men who have fallen. But
Then it makes sense, because he's building up this tower of heads or whatever as a show of strength and to scare other people from rebelling against his rule. That would make much more sense, I think. Okay, thank you for clarifying. But you talked about women, and I want to go back to that very quickly. So Akbar's story is packed with so many interesting characters: Shia scholars, Hindu Brahmins, Sufi mystics, Rajput warriors, Afghan chiefs, and whatnot, as well as a great number of artists and musicians of the time. But where are the women? If Akbar was so open to different perspectives, where are the perspectives of his wives? Why don't we hear from the voices of his various wives?
Yeah, so you have to ask the question. That's not the question for Akbar. That, I think, is a question for mankind in general. Why don't we hear the voices of everybody's wives more? Women tend to not be as well represented in history as men. That's just how things have been, and hope they will change. And they are changing.
Studied in depth, Jahangir as well as the other Mughal rulers. Is that something that you find across other Mughal rulers as well, or is that much more about Akbar?
That is certainly. I mean, there are some Mughal women who. So in the Akbar's time, there is his own aunt Gulbadan, who writes a memoir of Humayun's, her brother Humayun's rule, and it's a fantastic memoir, and I would recommend it for anybody to read. It's very easy to read, and it's very enjoyable. So she's a remarkable person, and I think that Ruby Lal is working on a book on her, so I'm looking forward to that. Will be a very interesting book when it comes out. So she writes, but women as a rule writing histories is not, it doesn't happen. In Jahangir's time, you have, of course, Noor Jahan, who becomes very, very powerful during his time. Even the coins are issued with her name on them, in her sort of name. And but she also doesn't, compose a history. I mean but that, that I don't think that is anything. That's just how it is. I mean, women are less visible in history and in historical sources and historical documents than now.
We know a great deal about Akbar's friendships with Mahesh Das, Birbal, or his affection for Tansen and other like Malman Singh. Why don't we know relationships with his wives?
I understand. So that I don't know. This is also a question that I asked myself, because, or at least if not his relationship with all his wives, his relationship with, whether he had one particular great love in his life, and all of the first 6 Mughals who are called the Great Mughals, all of them have somebody or the other. There's the Babur writes himself about falling madly in love with this young boy called Baburi. Humayun, of course, is besotted with Hamida, who refuses to marry him for 40 days. He has a long courtship trying to win her over. That's Akbar's mother. Then Jahangir, of course, with Noor Jahan.
And earlier Manbai is in the love affair with Noor Jahan.
Yes.
And then obviously Shah Jahan,
of course, with the Mumtaz. And even Aurangzeb has, there's a dancing girl called Hirabai that he's supposed to follow very much. But there's no such thing with Akbar. And I think so. I don't know whether this is because it didn't happen or because it's not recorded. And if it's not recorded, then it's possible. And this is a theory that I read in work by Harvansh Mukhia, that Akbar is once again influenced by certain ideas about womanhood and honor that he encounters in Hindustan. So in earlier writings, for example, in Babur's writings or in Gulbadan's writings, women are often talked about and they are named and they are shown doing things or going here, doing that, whatever. In the Akbarnama, that happens less, as in women are not even named. So not even Akbar's own mother, whose name is Hamida, is called Hamida. She's referred to by her title, which is Mariam Makhni. And later on in Jahangir's own memoirs, he doesn't refer to his mother Harkha by her name, but by her title, which is Mariam Uzzamani. So there is, in a sense, that women, and this is not just in the Akbarnama, it's also during Akbar's time that, again, Ruby Lal and others have written about this, how he actually builds, the harem is earlier a way of describing the women in a household, that it's not a place, but under Akbar's time, it becomes a fixed place, fixed palace in which the women live. And then it's guarded by layers and layers and layers of security. So in that sense, this idea that women embody a person's honor and therefore have to be protected from the outside and from the outside gaze, and even therefore then from the gaze of the reader or the historian, could be one reason why.
It's basically penetrating from the Rajputs into the Mughal.
That is what seems to be happening.
And it could also be possible the relationship with his consorts was also then guarded within the strict domain of privacy, where he did not wish to share that with the broader world.
It could be, but also, Akbar lives a very long life. So in terms of how much privacy and how guarded it is, it also changes. So there's this wonderful incident from when he's about 20 odd years old, in which there's this traveler from Persia who's come, and there's also a Persian ambassador who's coming to meet Akbar, the king, and this Persian traveler also happens to be around, and he records it, and this traveler is shocked because the ambassador arrives, and it's really impossible unless you know who Akbar is to tell which one of these people is the king, because he's just standing there in this very sort of relaxed, casual manner. He's got one arm around somebody's neck. He's sort of leaning like this. He's not looking regal at all. The same man talks about how at that time the Agra fort is the old, that doesn't exist anymore. It's much lower, of course, and obviously you can see into it. And he sees Akbar flying a kite, wearing a lungi and flying a kite on the roof with his hair open. So he's at that time, he's very much more casual and informal. There is even later on, there are Badauni, for example, says that Akbar is, he says that Akbar is very influenced by his Rajput wives, and it's because of them that he has, for example, given up onions and garlic, and that he is adopting Hindu customs. Badani is. He's ascribing this to Akbar's relationship with his wives and the influence that they exert on him. So it's not that, this information could even have been so well guarded. I mean, it's more likely that if it's not present in the official narrative, that it's because he didn't want it to be.
But Badioni was writing an official narrative. So if he had access, or if he had known about specific female figures from Akbar's harem, among his consorts, at least he could have written about them, because his biography wasn't the officially sanctioned biography.
Well, that's true. Then that's also true. He didn't have lots of, either he didn't have that much access, or he was himself not interested in, maybe he thought of it as gossip and he didn't want to. He had more important things that he was complaining about. There's even the Jesuits, the Montserrat also writes about it, but how, they are called, when they arrive, they are called to stand in the courtyard, because Akbar wants the women to see them, like his mother, his aunts, his wives. He wants them to see them, but he doesn't want them to see the women. So he's obviously
custom, right? Because among his aunts and in his parents' generation, the women were going out and meeting people.
Very much so. His aunt, his great aunt Khanzada Begum, in fact, was like an ambassador between these warring brothers, and she used to. There are paintings of her sitting in with Babur in court. So
it would be impossible for Central Asian women to observe any kind of parda when they had to travel all these long distances on horses and everything. It just doesn't make sense. It's basically already, it seems like in Akbar's time, there is this change that has happened where the sedentary culture has also brought in the concealing of women behind closed doors, I guess. To me, what is fascinating here is that usually in common, normally people have this impression that it is the Islamic influence that resulted in this culture of jalis and putting women in zanana khanas and Rajput palaces. But here it seems like it has been the other way around. It's the Rajput influence on the Mughals that has played out in this way.
In this case, it certainly is. It does seem to have been the other way around, because the Central Asian women are far more, there's this idea of concealment is not at all as prevalent there, and the women there are some very remarkable women in the sort of distant parts of that family who are leading men into battle also, and presiding in court also, and and here there's just this idea, that basically it's this idea of women embodying honor. So the same Khanzada Begum, for example, has to, when Babur loses Samarkand, his sister Khanzada is married to Shaibani Khan, who takes Samarkand from him, and Babur is very, very upset by this, but it's part of the deal that, and so Babur escapes, and eventually then Shaibani Khan dies, and Khanzada Begum comes. By this time, Babur has given up on Samarkand. He's in Kabul, where he spends most of his life. And Khanzada Begum comes to Kabul, and it seems that she hardly even recognizes him because he's grown so much. But that's just an aside. But it's not like she's come and this is somehow she has brought shame on the family by having been married to an enemy king, or that somehow she has to be hidden away. She's welcomed, and she participates in all affairs of the family, and she remains a very, very highly respected person through his reign, through Humayun's reign. So yeah, this idea of shame doesn't exist.
This actually suggests a very complex kind of exchange going on between the Mughals and the Rajputs. On the one hand, we have some evidence that Akbar finds the state of women in India, especially the Rajput women, somewhat oppressive. He goes ahead and prohibits sati to whatever extent he can.
He doesn't. He doesn't prohibit sati. That's because he said he prohibits unwilling sati.
But he discourages it, right?
He doesn't like it.
And I think there is some notion that he also tried to legalize widow remarriage in India, raise the marriage age. I don't know how much of this is like apocryphal or true, but it's interesting to me at one end he's thinking of somehow improving the lot of women in India, and at the other end he's trying to emulate Indian women in his own court by creating similar kind of closed spaces for Mughal women, emulating the Indian women. It's very complex,
It is, yeah, because he's not a 21st century feminist. He's not like I don't mean to suggest that that sons, for example, are not valued in Central Asian culture and in his own family. He himself, prays for Salim and for to have an heir. But there's a difference between sort of valuing sons. He even tells a story about this. Some one of his foster mothers who was only having daughters. This is a Central Asian woman, and was only having daughters. And her husband said, "If you have one more daughter, I'm going to divorce you." And so she was very sad. And this is one of these little stories of miracles of Akbar's childhood. And he met her, and he said, "No, you will have a son." And she did have a son, and all that. So certainly, sons are valued. That's not something that it's not that. But there's a difference between valuing sons and devaluing daughters in a sense. So, and this is not. So there's this very wonderful book, a kind of autobiography by this Jain poet, Jain jeweler stroke poet. He's a better poet than a businessman, called Banarsi Das. It was written at that time, and that again I would recommend to everybody to read. It's very, very enjoyable, and there's a lovely translation if it also available. It's a throwaway line. He talks about. He says, "My sister." He has a sister, and my sister is born, and she is the result of karma. So in that sense of daughters being a sort of a result of karma, or sort of a something that is not worthy of celebration, which again, Abul Fazl mentions more than once that when Akbar has daughters, he celebrates their birth, and he says he does it against the usage of contemporaries. So around him the custom here it's really not to, but Akbar still does. Oh, that's it. It's not that he also creates this quarter. He has many rules and regulations that he offers, and this is, I think, Badauni who's listing this. mad range of different rules that he comes up with every so often. And one of them is about how, if women behave immodestly, then they should live in he creates a sort of prostitutes quarters called Shaitanpur in Fatehpur Sikri, and any immodest women will have to go there. So it's not, it's not that the idea of modesty in women is not prized. It's not that sons are not prized, but there is a distinct difference.
And in some ways, he does come across as a 16th century man, right?
He is a 16th century man, yes.
So you mentioned Babur and Baburi, the love affair. So I really just quickly want to touch upon Akbar's reaction to homosexual relations in his court. Like what it seems that he comes across as a fervent homophobic person through some of his actions with regards to same-sex couples in his court. How do you explain this? Like, what was the reason for his intolerance towards same-sex love?
So what is interesting, I think, about this is that it is actually unusual that he doesn't approve of men having affairs with other men. And there are some great love affairs that happen. The greatest of them is this Ali Kuli Shehbani, the Uzbek, who led the troops against Himu in Panipat, and then later on rebels against Akbar. Leads this great Uzbek rebellion against him, and in between he falls in love with this young man, and it becomes the talk of the town, and it's just it's a great. Like Badauni is talking about it, and Abul Fazl is talking about it. It's a great event that happens. And Akbar is very, very unhappy, and he tries to break this apart and put a stop to it. But what is interesting is that it's not that everybody else did. I mean, it's not that Badani himself sounds particularly unhappy about it. Behram Khan, who is the regent at that time, Akbar's regent at the time, is not, he's a great friend of Ali Kuli's, and he's trying to smooth the troubled waters, and he's not in any way shocked or disapproving of what is going on. So I mean, really, what it is that, and Akbar again is very young at this time, and maybe it's just something that gets into his head. Maybe it's something that happens partly because when Abul Fazl writes about it, and Abul Fazl is writing about this much later, not when it happens. When he writes about it, he keeps referring to it as this, paraphrasing, but this abomination or this vile manner of Transoxiana of Central Asia. So in a way, some historians have suggested that it could be a way of putting down again the same Central Asian ability that Akbar is, trying to reduce the power of through much of his reign. It could be that. I mean, what it is. It could be that he thought the idea, because he's a boy at this time, and he's surrounded by very, very powerful warlords. It struck me, this is just the slightest thought, that it might have been that he was uncomfortable with the idea, given his own location, given his own, what if, would it be possible that somebody might try to seduce him as a way of getting to the throne? Was that something that possibly played in his mind? I don't know. But
he does it even later in his career, right? Like, it's not just that in his early days he tries to prevent such relations. Even much later in his career, he goes against...
Yeah, there are several mentions. I can't remember exactly when they all happen, but there's more than one mention of such affairs that he doesn't approve of.
He's not like a religious person and dogmatic person in the sense.
No.
So it's interesting.
No.
Because mostly it's the people who are dogmatic are against them. And here is this guy that we are examining as a potential role model for a tolerant society. So this streak of intolerance in him is like baffling to me.
It is no, so I don't know. It's if you talk about religion, one of the oddest things is about how in this Ali-Kuli story, the Ali-Kuli story is that he falls in love with this guy called Shahim Beg, who's was a big flirt, as it turns out, breaks Ali-Kuli's heart. But when Ali-Kuli falls in love with him, Shahim Beg is a great believer. He's a very strict believer, and as a result. I think it's Badauni who writes that Ali-Kuli also becomes very strict in his observation of Islamic law, which is like, if you think about this now in the 21st century, you think this is just like, can't fit it in your head, right? But things work differently and can work differently at different times. And as far as Akbar, in this particular case, I think it could also just be, he over the course of his life, he also becomes increasingly ascetic-like, in his personality. He becomes more and more vegetarian. He issues this one of his statements that he would. That if he had known better, he would never have married at all, because his people are like children to him. He didn't need to marry and have his own children. He starts to practice sort of celibacy. So he's also, I mean, who knows? Maybe he's got this sort of ascetic streak to him also.
So you're saying that maybe he looked at same-sex relations, which are purely for pleasure, clearly not for procreation, in some kind of frivolous or debaucherous light, which may have. It's obviously. But one thing that seemed interesting to me, and I don't know, it might just have been, but it seemed like all the relationships, all the love stories that are mentioned like this, they seem to be like. Only one side's consent is obvious, which is of the aristocrat. And in most of them, the other side is of somebody of a lower social rank, be it a soldier or a dancer or whatnot. And their consent is not really mentioned. So I'm just thinking, like, could it, because in this time, right, a lot of these relations were pediatric, right, like with big age difference. Could it be that like Akbar had himself been a victim of certain advances when he was kidnapped by his uncles? Or maybe I'm just...
I think that would be speculating too far. I don't know. I mean, there would be absolutely no evidence to suggest it. So, it would be this we are, then we are wandering into the realm of historical fiction. Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. I'll conclude basically with a question with which you probably expected me to start. And that is, what prompted you to write this book right now? Like, why this interest in Akbar? And it's not just you. I think the whole of India seems to be interested in Akbar. There's this renewed interest in a dynasty from 1500. What prompted it? What instigated you to undertake this research?
I think, initially what instigated me was that I just had like a whale of a time. I had a really a lot of fun writing Jahangir, and I thought it was finished too quickly and I wanted to write another one. And we were discussing, with my publishers, like which one, and I wasn't sure. And everyone seemed to be saying, well, Akbar. And I wasn't at all sure about Akbar because it seemed like too much, And this, I say to everybody, but it was Chikki Sarkar who had said that, if you're going to write about the Mughals, Akbar is, sooner or later you're going to have to come to terms with him or confront him. So, you might as well. So then I said, sure. And I started reading and I'm really, really glad that I did, because first of all, I think, understanding the Mughals without understanding Akbar is, it's incomplete. He does actually found that dynasty. But also I'm very glad I did, because it was just a challenge for me in terms of, assimilating all this information, trying to come to grips with a man who is so complicated and so multifaceted and so much, such a has so many sides to him. Not always good, but not always bad. And finally, I think over these last 3 years, it seems that I have been working on Akbar at a time where there was a lot about, about him that and his Hindustan that made me think about the present also, because after all, he is in a sense creating an empire and not just conquering it. He's not just going and fighting these bloody battles and making these towers of heads and putting down all these rebellions. He's also spending a lot of his time sitting with his administrators, his advisors, his accountants, putting in place these systems that will, with which to rule this empire and to rule it in his. It's clearly, his ambition is to rule it with justice, and he creates this template in a sense, and he comes to this idea of the Sulh-I-Kul and this peace for all, which is not just it's not just a sort of administrative framework for an empire. It's not, it's not just a geographical boundaries of an empire that he creates, but also an ideological framework. And that ideological framework survives, from Sulh-I-Kul to, let's say, unity and diversity over the centuries. And as I was writing it, I mean, in India, as we are seeing, there's a whole other ideological framework that is being sought to be created, and that this idea of the Hindu Rashtra that is finding many proponents now, so it seemed like, in that sense, it seemed, by the time I was in the second and third and final drafts of this book, the more I wrote it, the more I read, the more things around me were changing, the more it seemed like there was a lot that Akbar's Hindustan could have to say to us now.
So you think Akbar could be a model statesman for multicultural India?
I do think so, yes. Yes.
I think more than anything else, Akbar's secular credentials are burnished by the ire he still invokes among religious hardliners in both India and Pakistan. Parvati, this was a huge pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Yadu. Thank you very much. It was lovely.
Bye-bye.